Welcome to the final SIWI Corner. It's time to look into the future, or more specifically ahead to 2050. And there are a lot of promises being made for 2050. For example, with countries and companies claiming that they will be carbon neutral by 2050. But what will water look like in 2050, and what are the main challenges ahead? Joining me to talk about how we could get there are Owen Gaffney from the Postdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and Malin Ingemarsson from SIWI, who works with landscape management and global policy. Malin, how can we expect our world to look in 2050?
By 2050, 10 billion people may inhabit Earth. And our main challenge is to remain within the 9 planetary boundaries, as you can see in the image here. These planetary boundaries, they were introduced by Johan Rockström in 2009. And they are a great help for us to understand the conditions for human development. Take, for example, the planetary boundary for freshwater. That is the total yearly water consumption, for example, in households and industries and agriculture, and also in energy production. With climate change and also a growing demand and an increase in population, our thirst for water risks exceeding the resources that we have within just a few decades.
Okay, and clearly we need to make sure that we don't cross that freshwater boundary. Are we at risk of doing that right now? And if so, is water being considered properly in decision making?
Today, there is, I think, more positive momentum than have ever been before, and also a strive for action. But as I see it, there is a great risk in making decisions without considering water. Take companies or countries, for that sake, that don't use the water perspective. They risk causing irreversible changes to the water cycle, which could lead to lack of food or lack of water. And we really need to change that perspective so that policymakers truly understand the role of water in the work with climate change, both mitigation and adaptation.
Right, so how can we change how we see the role of water in climate change?
I would say that action and also effective solutions are key. There are many smart solutions that are linked to water, both technical and nature-based. And in an upcoming report, we are mapping mitigation solutions that are either impacted by water or they impact water. And the aim of the report is to support countries and cities and companies and so on to make climate smart policy that have water in consideration.
That's so interesting, and thank you for sharing those insights. Owen, you recently wrote the book Breaking Boundaries together with Professor Johan Rockström about how the world can stay within these planetary boundaries. And that's also the focus of the Exponential Roadmap initiative that you co-founded. You argue that we need to achieve exponential emissions reductions. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, sure. So, as Malin said, by 2050, we need to stay within planetary boundaries, to pull ourselves back within planetary boundaries. And one of the key boundaries is, of course, climate change. And we've gone beyond incremental change. You know, it's no longer possible to stay within boundaries and just make incremental change year on year. So we published a paper back in 2017 arguing for the first time that we need exponential change. The only trajectory that will stabilize us within planetary boundaries is actually to halve emissions every decade. And this, you know, there are many emission scenarios giving many solutions to the future, but many of those those scenarios are not entirely plausible. They rely too much on negative emissions technologies and carbon offsetting at massive scales. But really halving emissions every decade is the trajectory we need to be on, and it's just about feasible. If we start now, it is possible to halve emissions by 2030 across all sectors. And the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, that initiative is about trying to chart that out. What are the key solutions that are already shovel ready that could be implemented immediately and scaled immediately to do that. But it's a Herculean effort. This is one of the biggest challenges humanity has ever faced, and we really need to start now.
I understand completely the urgency of this, and I know that you've mentioned that the two major transformations that need to happen by 2030 are to halve emissions and become nature positive. What is the role of water in all of this?
Yeah, so it's not just about halving emissions. It is also, as you say, we need to turn our agricultural system from a source of emissions to a sink of emissions. And in fact, we need to do that by around 2030, within a decade. And we need to protect our remaining carbon sinks, the wetlands and rainforests. And we know that the water cycle is changing. The water cycle is incredibly important for protecting those systems. So that's going to be so water management is going to be incredibly important for us to be able to stay on that exponential trajectory.
Yes, exactly. As you say, water is essential for all of the planetary boundaries. You've talked a little bit about the current geological epoch, that one of the defining features is that we're disrupting the global water cycle. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Anthropocene is really possibly one of the defining ideas of the last 30 years, that humanity is now the main driver of change on Earth. And the defining feature then of the Anthropocene is this disruption of the hydrological cycle, of the water cycle. And for each 1 degree Celsius we rise in temperature, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water. So, as temperatures rise 3 or 4 degrees, then the atmosphere is going to hold 25% more water than today. And that's going to have a massive disruptive impact. So even by 2050, by 2060 or so, we're going to have huge changes to the water cycle. And it's really uncertain exactly what that means. We know that wet areas are going to get wetter and dry areas are going to get drier. And even just this summer, we're getting some taster of what that means when wet areas get so much wetter that we see, torrential flooding in China, across Europe, and we're seeing these unprecedented dry spells and heat domes across the Canada and the United States. So we have to start adapting to that. We need to start preparing for these sorts of extremes, which actually are surprising the scientific community. The science community hasn't really anticipated this scale, this fast, and with this ferocity.
It's impossible to deny that the urgency of the situation. And what are we seeing in terms of the solutions that are ahead of us and the innovations that could maybe help us tackle this issue?
Yeah, so we really need to get to work on this immediately. We have 25% of our crops are already grown in water scarce regions. We know that by 2050, 5 billion people, half the planet, will be living in under severe water scarcity unless we start managing things right now. So, there's clear innovations we need in terms of infrastructure for better water management, in terms of agriculture to manage our water far more efficiently than we are presently. And in terms of early warning systems, we really need better early warning systems to prepare for things. And in terms of infrastructure, what we're thinking about, is re-engineering cities. We need sponge cities, we need floating cities, and we need to make big decisions about coastal regions and which ones to protect and which ones are just going to be too expensive to protect, and we need other approaches. So governance is going to be a defining feature in the Anthropocene of how we operate, and not just general governance of the water system, the hydrological cycle, at local levels, at national levels, at transnational levels, is going to be critical. That's going to be a make or break governance issue over the next 30 years.
I understand, and we really do need this collaboration, long-term visions, bipartisan support if we're going to be able to make these changes that we need to make. Thank you, Malin and Owen, for helping us understand the challenges that we're facing. And in a moment, we'll be joined by two new guests to talk more about the solutions we see. But first, we'll hear about Professor Johan Rockström, who we mentioned earlier, and see what he thinks is the most important water actions in the next 20 years.
The most important water action of the next 30 years is to build water resilience by interacting across all planetary boundaries, connecting biodiversity, water, climate, nutrients, and building societies, cities, communities that are better able to deal and respond with extreme events. And we also need to invest, water investments that can enable us and provide us with more carbon sinks through nature-based solutions, with better and more robust ecosystems that are thriving and delivering for humans, but also keeping carbon stocks intact. So basically integrating the water climate agenda for mitigation and adaptation.
Hello, and welcome to two new guests, SIWI's Chief Operating Officer, Karin Gardes, and Panchali Saikia from SIWI's Water and Sanitation team. You will help us look at water trends and how we can manage water smarter by 2050. But first, I was wondering if you had anything to comment on, any reflections on what we just heard from Malin and Owen and now Johan Rockström.
It was very interesting to listen to them all. They make it quite clear that we are going to face enormous challenges. We must really focus and prioritize in terms of creating these processes of fast transformation, taking water as an entry point.
I agree. It was very interesting to listen to them. And what I take from it is really that it will take bold prioritization and very much political courage to find those and identify those solutions that they referred to. But we will also need very much continuity in creating an enabling environment for these solutions to be implemented. And such an enabling environment is characterized by good governance, good water governance, but also by transparency, participation beyond representation, and not least rule of law.
Absolutely. Thank you both for your reflections. And we will talk more about the challenges that we'll face in 2050 a little bit later. But I thought we could start with a quiz just to see a little bit about what water looks like now and how it might look in 2050. And we asked these questions on the SIWI Twitter page as well. So we'll see what our followers know. But feel free to answer yourselves as we go through the questions. So how much water does it take to produce a cup of coffee? Here we see that the answers were actually pretty divided when we asked this to our followers. And I understand the correct answer is approximately 130 litres, although estimates tend to vary. And it's hard to imagine that a cup of coffee can cost 130 litres of water. And it's measuring how much water we use in our day-to-day activities. That's what we call a water footprint.
The concept of a water footprint is actually extremely powerful and at times quite mind-blowing. I'm saying this because understanding how much water is actually needed to produce something is fundamental to really help us understand how much we are dependent, I would say, not only on water, but on significant quantities of water. And as a general rule, I can say that the water footprint is always much higher than one thinks. So with that knowledge of how much water it really takes, we can make sure that both consumers and companies can take informed decisions and adapt maybe their consumption and production patterns to really make sure that we decrease the general water footprint.
For sure, and I agree, it is often shocking when you realise just how much water things cost, so to say. Another question we asked our followers was how many people experience water stress at least 1 month per year. And now if we look according to the definition used by UNICEF, they think that around 4 billion people are already affected. What are the projections looking like for 2050?
Well, the projections for 2050 actually tell us that about half of the world's global population will be affected. And this is, of course, terrible and very significant. And it's a growing problem. But nothing is certain. It's not set in stone. It will depend on very many factors, such as indeed population growth and not least demand for water.
And So how much will then the global demand for water have increased by 2050?
There are different projections, so I would not know exactly. But in 2018, the United Nations World Water Development Report estimated an increase of around 20 to 30% if there is a population increase of around 9 to 10 billion people in 2050. But this will really depend on the choices and the decisions we are making today, which is why what Karin said about the water footprint is very important.
Truly, and what is it that's driving this expected increase in demand?
There are multiple drivers. I would say climate change, of course. There is this socio-economic habits, economic growth, land use changes, and this will eventually really increase the competition among the different water users.
I understand. And on to another question, looking at how this might look in 2050. How much food will we need to produce in 2050?
This is actually another contested area and very complex. I would say there has been some studies in terms of really saying that there will be an increase of 50% to 70% if we see that increase of population of 10 billion in 2050. And I would really say again that this depends again on the consumption patterns, the social norms, and the methods of agricultural practices, cropping patterns. I'm not an expert on this, but I would say that given that 70% of the fresh water is used for growing food, this is actually going to be an enormous water challenge.
Truly. And if we then assume that there is 10 billion people living in the world by 2050, how much waste will this population produce?
Well, I think there is a report from the World Bank that estimates that this increase in pollution will be around 70%. That level of pollution is, of course, disastrous and can have catastrophic consequences. And I would personally say that we need to avoid getting there almost at any cost, because the consequences of it will really be catastrophic. So we need to create a genuinely circular economy by recycling water in a much higher scale than today. So in other words, we need to use the existing water resources in a much more smart and sustainable way.
Absolutely. And now that we've set the context, looking at how like food demand and water demand and even how much waste could maybe be produced by 2050, let's also have a look at some solutions that may make the next 30 years a little bit easier. For example, in 2050, will cities have turned into swamps?
Many cities are actually working towards protecting and restoring their wetlands, and this is going to really benefit both human and environment in terms of protection from floods, improving the natural water quality, groundwater recharge, and even in terms of meeting the growing water demand. From my experience working with cities, I have seen that more needs to be done in terms of improving the overall urban water governance, not just focus on the wetlands, but also urban rivers and the wider city basin.
I agree with Panchali. The role of cities will be absolutely key. It's estimated that in 2050, about 70% of the world's population will live in cities. And many of those new city residents, if I can call it like that, will be rather poor and probably live in informal settlements around megacities without much of the urban planning that Panchali was referring to. It also means that we really must design solutions so that we can actually respect the human right to water and see to it that every citizen has access to water and sanitation and are better prepared and more resilient for the expected consequences of these climate change and the extreme weather events. And only then will we be able to actually deliver on Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which we have committed to deliver on by 2030.
I understand, and we're already starting to see the consequences of these extreme weather events on cities now. A slight change of topic. In 2050, will we drink pee?
Technically, it actually is possible to convert pee into safe drinking water, say, for example, how the astronauts does it. On Earth, Namibia's capital, Windhoek, actually had done it, was the first to do it in terms of converting this. But of course, it may not be an easy sell. There has been different layers of the treatment process and different purposes it has been used. But I must say that new technology is making cheaper and easier for converting nutrients and energy from the wastewater. And we can't really continue to release the majority of wastewater untreated into the nature.
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only one that is relieved that there will be other options, and it's really encouraging to hear about so much innovation, much needed innovation in wastewater treatment. On a similar strain, in 2050, will we have stopped using water toilets?
Interesting questions. I see a lot of development in terms of off-grid solutions where you build safe toilets which are not connected to the sewage systems. But this might not be possible to really build for new inhabitants across different mega cities. But there could be alternate options, and there has been some exploration around that.
Well, Bill Gates actually has talked about a toilet revolution on par with the digital revolution. So who knows?
Okay, wow. And in 2050, will we have worked towards ending poverty?
We should have, Georgette. We really should have, because we have committed to. We have actually committed to do it way before 2050. We have committed to do it by 2030, and we did that in 2015. So we're half there to the 2030 landmark. And unfortunately, we see that global poverty is actually growing again after having decreased for quite some years. Currently, around 9% of the global population live on less than $2 a day. And the World Bank estimates that some 100 million people have been pushed back into poverty as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's important to note that this trend of poverty growing again actually started before the pandemic, but of course the pandemic has further increased that number. And climate change and conflict are for sure growing drivers of this poverty.
Again, an extremely concerning trend to hear about. What can we do to reverse this trend?
Yes, of course, we need to really focus on improving the food security, securing the smallholder farmers, and also in terms of ensuring irrigation water use efficiency, restoring the degraded ecosystem, and not to forget ensuring universal access to water and sanitation. Here again, I would like to really focus on improving water governance, ensuring having pro-poor strategies, also community-driven response and recovery measures, early warning systems that can really protect the people from disasters like flood and drought. Just to share that World Bank had estimated that there is this impact on people from the catastrophic like flood is actually the poor people.
That really is tragic to hear that already vulnerable people are being disproportionately affected by these extreme, for example, changes in weather. So to summarise, the trends for 2050 seem to indicate that we will need more water than we need today, but we also could have access to less water than we have today. How do we solve that?
The solutions are mostly there. We just need to apply it, make it more actionable with accountability and also taking ownership to ensure the responsibilities and the goals that are planned is met. My key message here will be to not just focus on quantifying the value of water, but also understanding and acknowledging the multiple values, the social, the economic, the cultural and philosophical, etc. Towards this, what will be needed is meaningful participation of diverse groups, indigenous communities, youth, women. And here I say meaningful participation because it's not just about representation. You need to really reflect these perspectives and integrate in the policies and in terms of the integration and interventions. There have been some efforts, but are we really doing enough?
Probably not, Panchali, and I agree with you. The first step is really to understand and to articulate pedagogically how dependent we are on water, and not only on water, but on significant amounts of water as a natural resource, but also to understand how undervalued water is as a natural resource. Most of the planet's greatest challenge that we face today actually are water related. But let's be honest, we are probably the first generation that could look at all these challenges in the eye and say we have the financial means, we have the technical and the technological means, we have the human means to actually tackle those challenges. The real question is, do we have the political will to do it, to actually implement those solutions that are mostly there? And from my perspective, because we can do it, we actually must do it. That will really be our responsibility for future generations. SIWI stands ready to do its part together with partners.
I couldn't agree more. And thank you both for those inspiring words and for sharing your insights and for, of course, assuring me that there are other options than drinking pee. For anyone watching who is interested in hearing and learning more about how we can use water to build resilience faster, you will find our conclusions from World Water Week on our website, siwi.org. I would like to leave you with this inspiring video on what we need to do ahead of 2050. And to echo my colleagues, there is no time like the present. So let's start today.
In 2050, Earth could be home to 10 billion people. But we will not have more fresh water than today. To avert a water crisis, we need to make these 5 changes. Number 1, value water. Water is a finite resource with no substitute. We must stop wasting and polluting it. Countries should restore ecosystems that clean water and invest in water recycling. Number 2, share water. Water must be managed sustainably and fairly. Countries should prioritize the needs of the poor and of future generations. Having access to clean water and safe sanitation is a human right. When countries share a river, they should manage it together. Number 3, transform agriculture. Food security is a growing concern when climate change and degraded lands make farming more difficult. But financiers can help farmers shift to a more sustainable and water-smart methods. Number 4, restore ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems protect us from the effects of climate change while providing us with food and water. Governments and companies must protect and restore forests, rivers, wetlands, and oceans. Number 5, build resilience. Design infrastructure, cities, and safety nets adapted for a more uncertain future with more extreme weather events. Start with the needs of the poorest. Water is key to achieving a more resilient and more fair world in 2050. That's why we must protect it. Now,